I have decided to do something new. I've decided to make a kind of podcast thing that will also be on YouTube. But it will basically be me talking about a book I have just read, or just a book I have read. And my two rules, I think there's two rules, is that one, it will have minimal editing, so it's only I will only edit like very long stretches of just saying nothing, and I'll just try to edit it as least as possible. Yeah, I know I think it will be very rough in the beginning. Hopefully, I will get better at it, and also since English is my second language, I will probably make a lot of mistakes in pronunciations and grammar, and hopefully I will be better at that as well. My second rule is that I will talk about the book as best as I can remember it, and I will not try to look things up, so the exact dates I will not look up on something, but it will be more like, you ask a friend, oh, so you read anything interesting? You should ask your friends if you don't do that. And then they'll say, oh yeah, I read this book, and you'll be like, all right, what's it about? And then he will try to explain it, and that will basically be how I will structure this. And maybe it will not be of much interest to anyone, but then it will just be kind of notes for myself, so I can like go back and see, oh, I read this book like half a year ago, what was it about? And I can like listen to myself talk about it. So yeah, that's the plan with this show. Today I will talk about Bury the Chains, which is a historical book I read. I guess, yeah, non-fiction book. I think it's the historian is like Rothschild or something. The title and all that stuff will be in the intro. Or I should probably like have at least maybe the author's name and when the book is from and the title of the book. Those things I can look up. All right. But it's basically about how some people started to lobbying to abolish the slave trade, and the book starts. It's set in England, and it starts at starts around 70, 80, where we have this meeting of, I think it's around like 12 individuals, so like a very small group, and they meet and set out with the goal to try to abolish the slave trade. And it's pretty important that you realize that they want to abolish the slave trade. They don't want to abolish slavery. Many wanted to do that as well, but from the beginning with the group, the goal was to abolish the slave trade because that was seen as the most realistic thing to do right now. And the hope was when you abolish the slave trade, then you would actually also abolish slavery. The show will also, I forgot to mention that, but also kind of like, I guess it has the purpose of, oh, this is a cool book, you can check this out. But yeah, they wanted to abolish the slave trade. And the interesting thing that kind of surprised me a bit was that before 1780, around there, the Quakers, a religious group in England or Britain, whatever you say, they actually had been campaigning for a long time to abolish the slave trade, but nobody really took them serious. And the campaign only really took off when people from like the standard mainstream Church of England kind of took this on as an issue, and because then people actually listen and take it seriously. Because the author says that like before 1780, when there was just the Quakers, people didn't really, like, they just thought they was like nuts because Those people, they wouldn't take their hats off for any earthly authority, so they wouldn't like take their hats off, I think, for the king. And yeah, it was seen like these like maniacs. So when they were talking against the slave trade, then people would just be, oh, that's a Quaker, he's pretty insane. And what actually really surprised me with this book is that he said that in 1780, then if you would like ask people on the street, then 9 out of 10 people, if you said like, oh, we should abolish the slave trade or slavery, then they would just look at you like you were mad, or they was just like, what are you talking about? Like, it was just so taken for granted, so part of the social fabric. And then it says that the one person left out of the 10 who didn't just say, oh, you're crazy, what are you talking about? He would be like, oh, he would maybe agree with you, but then he'd be like, but that is just, it's impossible. Like, you cannot practically do that. And then I guess that's also like what makes the tale or the story so interesting for me, is that it's just like, the small group of people who, due to their rationality, due to how they saw the world, they were not slaves. They didn't have a brother that was a slave, because it was all white people in Britain, just far away from the slave trade. And they just banded together, and then they started this campaign, and they actually, I think maybe like 7 or 8 years later, the slave trade was actually abolished. I think oils, it's at least, maybe it's either like 8 years later or like 20 years later, then the slave trade was actually abolished. So in a very short time, they actually made like a huge difference. And it was just only a few years after they met the first time, this issue actually came to the fore in Britain. Like, suddenly everybody was just talking about slavery, and everyone was talking about how there was a lot of slave ships going out from Britain, and then they sailed to Africa, and they traded stuff, gave them, I guess, muskets and alcohol and stuff. And then the African chiefs who were in the habit of taking slaves, they sold the slaves, and then they sailed them to the West Indies, or in the Middle America, or whatever you call it. For example, all the islands that are like between South and North America, and made them work their ass off in sugarcane fields, like just horrible work. A lot of people died really quickly. And then, the trade goes back. They bring sugar. It was mainly sugar, the sugar plantations where they used the slaves. And so the sugar that comes back to Europe and back to Britain. And then they go catch some slaves again. So that's basically it's called the triangle trade, where the ships went in this triangle. The final abandonment of slavery was, I think it was like 50 years later. So it was a long time later, but finally slavery was abandoned. And he argues in this book that it's basically because of a few very dedicated people, we got slavery abolished at that point. And it's interesting because, the big hero, he actually, basically people started talking a bit about it. And then there was this guy, he was in charge, I think maybe Oxford University, or he was in charge of some university somewhere in Britain, I think. Or at least in charge of like putting in a topic that the students or each year in, I think, philosophy or something had to like write about. And then so he had like heard a bit about the slave trade because some people had started to write a bit about it. And so he put in the question for these students to write, and it was like, how can we justify slave trade? And then the guy who actually ended up being like the primus motor guy, or what's to call, the main guy to actually lobby for abolishing the slave trade, and he did this for like all the rest of his life pretty much, Like he rode around the whole of Britain, like just talking to people, doing lectures, and he was even close to getting killed in one of the like trade towns in Britain. Like I think it was Bristol, where the slave trade was like really big. He was almost thrown in like the ocean, and he couldn't really swim. So yeah, this guy is very interesting. He actually like didn't have much, an idea about slave trade, or he didn't think about it that much before. He had to he wanted to do this paper for this like competition where they had this competition where you have to write this paper, and I think everybody could like write it in, and then you would get like a lot of credit if you actually won this thing they used to do back in the days, also in France. I don't think they do that much more. Anyway, so he actually like, I want to win this competition, so I'm gonna study a lot about slavery. So he just looked at it and studied it. And then when he actually like ended up writing this paper, it's just like this really huge denunciation of slave trade and like very much against it, arguing, I think, both like from the Christian point of view and also like the rights of man and all this, I guess, equality, all that equality stuff. But and then actually after he wrote it, he had like this special moment where he's like writing, and then he was like, I know all this stuff about slavery, and this is just really horrible. Why is nobody doing anything about it? And he just like, I think he got off his horse and he sat down next to like close to a river, I think, and he's just like sitting there just thinking in the grass and be like, how is this thing in the world, and why doesn't someone do something about it? And then he got this, this, I guess, revelation idea that was like, all right, I'm gonna do something about it. Like, I'm gonna be the guy that's like gonna say, all right, this is just enough of this. I'm gonna like, he pretty much dedicated the rest of his life to just abolishing the slave trade. And then he just, I don't know, like he just like on the road constantly, and it just took so much longer to travel, and just all over and just talking with people, and and then I think he was also part of this like group that met. Pretty sure he was. And so people like they started to like make all these like small groups around in the cities, and then people began to write into their congressmen and write about this, and began to write about it in the newspapers, and suddenly like the whole Britain was talking about this, and it was like the big power at that time. And there was also when they finally banned the slave trade, I think they also started like banning it from, at some point, not sure if right away or other point, they just started to like ban it from other ships. So they were actually like, because they controlled the seas, they could just stop the ships and then be like, all right, this, you have to sail the ships back to Africa. They actually sailed it back to Africa to like, I think they released in like kind of free black community or something like that. So yeah, but people like the whole public just started to get really involved, and he says this is like really unique thing for the like history, because this was a moment where a lot of people just starting to become really involved in something that didn't really affect them. Like, they were not slaves, but they just saw the injustice of this fact that we are working people to death, we are taking them from Africa, bringing them in horrible conditions, the ships to Europe. And one thing that actually started was that the first boycott, he says even before like name was used, boycott, because it's named after this person who, I think the whole community boycotted him because he did something bad, and then everybody boycotted him, or everybody like shunned him, and his name was Boycott, so that became a thing. Then the thing Boycott is named after his last name. But anyway, it's they started to boycott the sugar like trade, or they started to boycott sugar because there was slave sugar, and they had a somewhat big effect, or at least raised things somewhat. But it was finally the slave trade was first abandoned after being shut down a lot in the parliament, and it has to go through the two chambers, and let's not get too much into detail about that stuff. But it was passed finally And it was also interesting to listen to the pro-slave arguments, because there was all these guys with economic interest in slavery. So the planters, those who had the plantations, which was often guys that live in England and they owned this plantation, so they had never been to Africa, they had never been to Middle America, to those islands in the middle, and they had a lot of different arguments. So the slave is so happy on the farm and being treated so kindly, and and some of their arguments are just completely ridiculous. The trip over the ocean is just the most happiest moment in the slave's life, where a lot of people actually killed themselves on board, threw themselves into the ocean because it was so horrible. And I don't know, they basically rolled around in all kinds of awful stuff in a stuffy hold for I think months it took, and just pretty much hell on earth. And then these guys are just, when he comes on board, he gets a cordial, he gets something to drink, and then there are plays on board, and just all this completely just ridiculous stuff that these slave traders and those plantation owners, those who had an economic interest in slavery, they used a lot of money to try to counter this anti-slavery, those abolitionists or whatever it's called. They use so much money to try to figure out, all right, when are they gonna write something? That newspaper will write something that counters that, and pretty much counter propaganda in today's society, if you wanna talk about that. But this historian that wrote this, Bury the Chains, I found the book because I read his I think it was a book called King Leopold or something, which talk about I think I'm pretty sure it's Belgium, and how the king just completely devastated the Congos and that whole story. And I was really impressed with how he writes history, and how he writes it just really with clarity, and just makes it so interesting to read. Yeah, I think that would be the first thing about, Bury the Chains. If you have anything that you want to ask about the book, or any questions, then go ahead. Alright.